morning. How many people have visited the bar already? Thank you. You're my people. I am really happy to be here. My name is Sarah May, and I'm a Ruby developer at Pivotal Labs in San Francisco. And I have wanted to come to this conference since it got started a few years ago. And this year, thanks to Kobe, I finally made it. And my job today is to ensure that you have absolutely no fun at this conference, just so we're clear. So let me start out by asking, how many people have fun when they're writing their Ruby code? Okay, thank you. I was really afraid that it was going to be one of these like everyone's asleep kind of mornings. I do too. I love Ruby. And part of what I love about it is the language itself, right? The Ruby language itself is amazing. And it's now 20 years old, which Ruby's from Japan, of course, and the legal drinking age in Japan is 20. So you should congratulate the Ruby team because their language can finally have a beer. But what I love about Ruby, maybe even more than the language itself, is that I love the community around Ruby. And I love hanging out with you guys. And I've been in a lot of developer communities over my career, and I've never been in one where the people were more creative or more fun or more social, had so many other interests besides code, or so many interesting projects to work on. But my friends, we have a problem. Our problem looks like this. Wild success. Ruby has been amazingly successful. We've gone from a fringe hobbyist language to almost maybe even a mainstream language in a couple of years, just a couple of years. And a lot of things that used to be small have gotten bigger. Symptom number one, in the last year we've started seeing a lot of conference talks and blogs and even books start to show up all around the theme of what happens when your Rails app grows up. So we've been talking about Rails engines, we've been talking about software architecture, we've been talking about object design. And these things are important. They're not important in a small code base, but they're important in a big code base. And even DHH, as much as he hates over-design, he's engaging on these things, right? He's engaging on the question because it's important, because we're all hitting a lot of these growing pains at the same time. Symptom number two, remember when Twitter was 12 people? That was a long time ago. And they're not the only one, right? Lots of companies that use Ruby, have a Ruby product, sell Ruby services, have gotten a lot bigger. They've grown, they've IPO'd, they've been acquired. As Rubyists, we're working not only with larger code bases, we're working on larger teams. And you can see that in the way that we've started discussing things like remote work, for example. Our small companies have grown up into big companies. And finally, symptom number three, the really, really big companies have started figuring out that this is something they want a part of. I've talked to people at conferences from HP, IBM, GE, and all of these companies are adding Ruby into their portfolio. And I've talked to a lot of people at different types of companies doing different types of things with Ruby, but I've heard a lot of the same story over the last year, and it's variations on a theme, but the basic idea is there's a developer, they want to build something cool, they want to have fun. So they go to work at a little company with a couple other people building a product. And now that little company seems to keep getting bigger, and they're a big company, and they have a big code base, and they're afraid. And what they're afraid of is becoming capital B big, right? They're afraid of this. They're afraid that their company's growth is going to suck all of the fun out of their job and out of programming for them. Now, having worked for a big company myself, I know that this is a legitimate fear. But with the influx of people into our community who already work at big companies, and with more of us becoming, whether we want to or not, working at big companies, I've started to see some interesting things that I would characterize as fear-mongering. Here's what it looks like these days. So there'll be a blog post, it'll probably make it to the top Hacker News. And it'll say there's two sides. And as a developer, you are on one side or you are on the other. If you are an established company person, what you like is process. You're very focused. You know what you're building. You are determined. You're unwavering. And then the other side would say that you're a little bit tunnel vision-y. If you're on the other side, if you're a startup person, you're creative. You have a lot of ideas. You value disruption. But the other side will say that you're a little bit immature. And these categories, I've seen them in lots of different places with lots of different people talking about them. And they have different headers. If you're talking to Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, which is a VC in Silicon Valley that funds small groups of 20-somethings in their garages, then your headers look like this. And recently in our community, I've seen this. And no matter who's talking about it, though, it's really clear what they mean. What they mean is that you as an individual developer at any given time in your life are in one of these categories or the other. You may move between categories, right? I mean, Paul Graham thinks it happens automatically when you turn 30. So, but the assumption here is that these are different types of people. And some folks will even go so far as to assert that you need both types of people in your company in order to balance stability and growth as you get bigger. We'll come back to that idea later. But right now, I want to drop something into this conversation we haven't had before. I want to talk science. These categorizations that people make are based on one person's generalizing from their experience. And that can be useful. But I'd like to remind you of something, which is that a collection of anecdotes does not add up to conclusive data. So what I want to do is look at some data. And I want to start with creativity, because if you look at these lists, the generalization here is that the stable side is boring and uncreative, and the volatile side is fun and creative, right? And all of these other properties flow from those initial judgments. So I want to look at the science around creativity for a moment. Who is creative, and how do you do it? In the 1970s, psychologists at Berkeley did some really fascinating work on the qualities of creative people. And they took two groups, people identified by their peers as creative and people identified by their peers as not creative. And they looked for statistically significant differences between these people. And here are some things that completely do not matter. Intelligence is kind of an interesting one. Smart people are no more likely to be creative than less smart people. Young people no more likely to be creative than older people. Women no more likely to be creative than men. African Americans no more likely to be creative than European Americans. And in essence, what they found is that there are no statistically significant innate differences between people who are creative and people who aren't. But what they did find were differences in behavior and in habits. And what that tells us is that creativity is not a quality that a person has or doesn't have. It's a mode of operating. It's a way of thinking. Now, I'll come back in a moment to what those habits actually are. But I think at this point, it might help to define creativity as scientists think about it, because I think we all have an intuitive feeling for what it is. Scientists distinguish between two modes of thinking that human beings engage in. And those are called closed mode and open mode. When you're in closed mode, you are getting very specific things done. Psychologists call this being executive. Your goals are very specific, and you're typically very focused on them. Then in the open mode, you may have general goals, but what you're doing is typically not very focused, and you're open to chance and unusual connections in your thinking. And it's in the open mode where creative thought can occur. So the first part of being a creative person just means knowing how to switch yourself between these modes deliberately. So what I thought was interesting about these lists is that they look kind of familiar, right? They look a lot like these categorizations we've been doing in our community, right? And it turns out that folks who want to put people in one of these two categories have actually hit upon a real dichotomy, right? But instead of different types of people, these are really just different modes of thought. And their critical error is in saying that a person, an individual, is one or the other. because we are all both. And I'd like to just enjoy that zen for a moment. We are all the amazing qualities of human brains. It's amazing. So when people say that you need both of these to balance against each other in a company, that's actually true, because we need both of these modes of thought when we're doing software development. And each of us needs to be able to do both. And a technical leader shouldn't be trying to hire these archetypes and play them off each other. A technical leader's goal should be to allow their people to do both of these things at the right time. So I think at this point, though, it's still fair to ask, like, what does being creative really have to do with software development? Isn't what we do computer science? That's what it says on my degree. Some people think of it as typing. I mean, what does it have to do with art or poetry or music or humor or dance, right? Those things are creative. Isn't what we do kind of mechanical in comparison? I mean, take, for example, the classic test-driven development cycle. First, you write a failing test. Then you write the code that makes it pass. Then you refactor the code, try it, make it better, right? And in practice, the cycle looks a little bit more like this. You write some code. You write a test. You write some code. You write another test. You write some code. You write another test. You write some code. Then you get some sort of vaguely standalone portion of the feature done, and then you refactor. So just to give you a concrete example of what this looks like, think about adding a method to a Rails model. You have a model for a bus, and you need a method that tells you how many iPads the passengers on your bus are carrying. So you write a model spec that fails. Then you write the method. Model spec goes green. Then you realize the story was actually asking for registered iPads. So you go back to the test. You add another line to the spec, which goes red again. Then you implement it in the model. Everything's green. And then you realize that maybe all this stuff doesn't belong in the model. And at this point you have thousands of options for what you could do with this code, right? You could leave it where it is. It works. Tests are green. You could extract parts of it and leave parts of it in the model. You could reimagine your domain model. I mean, you could rewrite the whole thing in Node.js, right? You got lots of options. But before we talk about these options, I want to consider for a moment what's different about these two phases of the cycle, right? First, you're doing the red, green, red, green, red, green, and then you refactor. What's different? So the first thing is that the words that we say are different when we're talking about code during these two different phases. So if you're pairing, these are the words you say out loud. I suppose if you don't pair, this is your like internal monologue, or maybe this is what you tell your dog, I don't know. But we go from, you know, when we're writing the code and we're writing the tests, we're discussing the nuts and bolts of the functionality, right? Oh, I think we're missing an end here. Maybe that context doesn't need to be there. Maybe we could inline that variable. And when we start refactoring, we start discussing larger concerns. We back up a little bit. Oh, this method started out with a name that made sense, and now it's not quite right. Maybe it doesn't belong in this class anymore. Maybe we could rename it. So the second thing that changes is the keys that we use on the keyboard kind of change, right? You go from entering code and entering logic and thinking about the logic to sort of moving stuff around, right? You cut and paste. I'm giving us the benefit of the doubt that we're not cutting and pasting in the top part of that section. Don't let me down on that one, okay? And the third thing that changes is our posture. So when you're doing the red, green, you're getting close to the screen. Your hands are on the keyboard. You're looking at the code. But when you refactor, you take your hands off the keyboard. You kind of sit back. And you look at the code without trying to change it right away. And of course, fundamentally, what's happening is that we're thinking differently about the code in these two modes. And how we're thinking has changed. And so when you're in the red, green phase, you're operating in closed mode, right? You're executing. And when you're in the refactor mode, you're moving into open mode. And so red, green refactor is actually a structured way of moving us between the closed and open modes when we're writing code. It's a habit that we have that gives us room to think creatively every time we write code. But it is kind of a funny habit. Is it creative? I think is still a valid question. This lady is an American dancer and choreographer named Twyla Tharp. She is currently 71 years old, and she is still considered one of the most creative forces in contemporary dance. And she wrote a fantastic book called The Creative Habit, in which she details how it is that she comes up with a new dance. And what she does is, in the morning, she dances her standard routines and moves for several hours. And she's moving her body in very familiar ways she's been doing for 30 or 40 years. She's executing, she's comfortable. And then in the afternoon, she works on coming up with new movements. And the movement she does in the morning serves as the raw material and gives her the base that she can then use to refactor into something completely new in the afternoon. And her process is designed to move her deliberately between the closed mode and the open mode. Closed mode being in the morning and the open mode in the afternoon. And she needs both of those to come up with a new dance. Because if all you do is execute, you'll never come up with something new. And if all you do is refactor, you'll never finish anything. So you need both to write great software. Oh wait, we're not talking about software. We're talking about dance. So the creative process actually does look the same across disciplines. And I think those of us who aren't professional artists tend to romanticize it a bit, and we think of it as going into a cave and coming out with a work of genius. But really what it's about is that you execute and then you rethink. And Red-Green Refactor gives us that time to be in the open mode. So the question that you get after that, right, is how do you proceed once you're there, once you're in that mode? Because once you're in that open mode, everything is possible. And figuring out the best option is usually a matter of shifting your context somehow, considering the code you wrote in a larger context, right? And that shift is the germ of creativity, no matter what type of creativity we're talking about, right? Painting and comedy and poetry and all of these creative works get their power from showing the viewer a context they hadn't noticed before. I want to give you another example. Humor. How many folk singers does it take to change a light bulb? Answer 5, 1 to change the bulb, and 4 to sing about how much better the old one was. How many anarchists does it take to change a light bulb? Answer none, because everyone knows they never change anything. And finally, how many enterprise developers does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, we're not going to change it, we think it works. It's this shift in context, right, between the setup and the punchline that gives jokes their power and makes them funny. So once you get into this creative mode, that's step 1, but then you need to be able to make that context switch once you're there. If I were a management consultant, which I'm not, I'd call it thinking outside the box, and then you'd have to shoot me, I guess. But really, so it's just context shifting that allows you to see an unintuitive solution to the problem at hand. One thing that I've noticed, though, is that different developers have different levels of skill with that part of the process. I've been pair programming full-time for about 3 years. I counted it up. I think I've paired with about 150 different people over that time. And some of them, when we're sitting there and we're looking at a refactoring, always seem to come up with a pretty decent solution. Sometimes it takes a while, but they always come up with something. And a lot of times what happens is that they have seen a piece of code recently that is similar to what we're trying to do. And a lot of times it feels like luck. You know, it feels like they just happened to be in the code base the other day, and they happened to see this other thing that we could reuse. And this happens a lot in big projects, especially when there's a lot of code and no one person knows all of it. But they happen to be looking at something in a completely different folder. And I was thinking about this, and I ran across some more science. I'm going to go back to this picture. I love this picture. And I ran across a really interesting paper that talked about what's different between people who consider themselves to be lucky and people who consider themselves to be unlucky. So the first thing they looked at is whether people who think they are lucky are, in fact, more lucky. And what they did was they took people who self-selected as lucky or self-selected as unlucky, and they gave them a section of the newspaper, and they said, go through this newspaper, count the number of photos, and bring the number back to the researcher. And on the second page of the paper was a half-page advertisement with no photos and big text, and the text said, stop, there are 36 photos, go tell the researcher. And people who considered themselves to be lucky consistently found that and noticed it more often than people who consider themselves to be unlucky, which is kind of an interesting thing. So once they had established that there actually is a difference between people who think they are lucky and people who think they are unlucky, they started to try and figure out what that difference was, similar to this creativity research. And just as with the creativity research, what they found was absolutely no innate differences between these groups of people at all. But once again, there are differences in behavior. It turns out that people who are lucky deliberately seek novelty in all parts of their lives. So for example, given the choice of two paths to walk, they will always pick the one that they haven't gone down before. Presented with a menu, they will choose the dish they haven't had before. These are little things, but by doing these little things, they are exposing themselves to things that are outside of their comfort zone. And in doing so, they are changing the mode in which their brain is working. And they are they're changing the mode of their thinking to be more open. And it means they notice things they wouldn't normally notice. And the end result is that they're able to see more of those context shifts, and it makes them unusually effective problem solvers. So it turns out that lucky is just another word for, I guess, reads a lot of random crap. So coming back to our list of properties, there's a lot of red-green refactor is one of the habits we have that allows us to give us this space, that gives us this space to be creative. But it's not the only thing that we have. For example, the process we do at Pivotal on a typical day, as a developer, me and my pair will take the top story off the tracker backlog, which presumably is the most important thing, and we'll do it. We'll red-green refactor the heck out of it. We'll finish it. And then we will go take the next story off the top of the backlog, and we'll do that. And that's what we do pretty much all the time. And it feels awesome. It feels amazing to get so much stuff done. But once a week, we also do something else. We do a retrospective, which is a 1-hour meeting where we talk about our process, and we talk about what's working and what's not working with the process. And it's our chance to think about how the process is working and how we'd like to change it. And I don't think I could do the process without the retrospectives because, well, developers at Pivotal call this particular part of the process the story mill because we're churning through stories. And it's a very executive, it's a very closed, you're just getting shit done all the time. But retros are the open mode that sort of balances the story mill's closed mode. And doing those retros weekly is a structured way of introducing creative thinking into our process, just like the refactor stage is a structured way of introducing creative thinking into our code. So ultimately, what it comes down to is that process, when it's done right, enables us to be creative. And being creative is what enables us to build great software, and the goal of the process should be to give us that space and to teach us the habits of creative people. And if that's not what yours feels like, you should think about refactoring it in that direction. And if you're at a company that's growing or is already big and you need to start adding more structure to your development process, it's a difficult thing, right? And you need to be careful. You need to be careful that you're not squeezing all of the fun and creativity out of your development. You need to make sure that your process gives your developers this space to think creatively, because that's what makes it possible to write great software. And finally, the process will give you that time, but it's your job to introduce enough novelty into your life to take advantage of that time once you have it. And you don't even need to spend $120,000 on art school. It's pretty awesome. Here's some things you can do when you're working to make you more open. And the first thing is to look at parts of your code base beyond what's immediately in front of you. Now, this can be little stuff, right? If you see a method being used and you don't know how it's implemented, go look at it, right? And spelunk through parts of the code you haven't seen in a while. Fill your mind with the sort of raw material of this creative thought. And the second thing is to try and vary what you do as much as possible. Consulting work agrees with me because I have a very short attention span. I switch projects every few months. But if you can't do that, you can still do things like try looking at some JavaScript if you're a back-end developer. Try looking at some SQL optimization if you usually do JavaScript. My rule for this is that once you start feeling comfortable, it's time to move on. And the third thing you can do is seek out teams that have people on them who don't look like you. And this is an interesting hack. There's been some research that tells us if you have two problem-solving teams, and what they do requires some creative thought, and one team is better qualified on paper, but they all look the same, and the other team is less qualified on paper, but they look different, meaning they have differences in height or race or gender or ability and things like that, then the less qualified team consistently does better. And the theory there is that when you are communicating with people that don't look like you, that don't have exactly your communication style, it's another way, it's another source of novelty. It's another way of kicking your brain into this quasi-creative mode that will allow you to make the connections you need to make. And so I have a couple of other suggestions, since I'm which you'll have to indulge me since I'm the first talk of the day, of things you can do to introduce more novelty into your life right now. I'm guilty of this. I come to a conference, I hang out with all the pivots who are there. Try talking to someone who's in a different company's swag. It's pretty awesome. Let them tell you what they do. Let them tell you about their problems and their code base and what they're working on. I guarantee you're going to hear a lot of interesting tech stuff today, and 80% of it you're going to go, yeah, that's kind of cool, but there's absolutely no application of that in my work. Oh well, but try it anyway. Even if it's just a little project, download it and give it a try. This is one of the things I love about conferences. I meet all these people that I only know on Twitter. It's really fun to make the virtual world real. And finally, since this is Ruby on Rails, try a beer you don't usually like. I don't usually like IPAs, but I figure I can give it a shot, right? And finally, please have fun. That's what this is about. Writing code should be fun, and you can make it fun even in a corporate setting, even in a startup setting. You can make it fun and creative no matter where you're working, as long as you make sure that you've got the right structure to give you that space. So, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.